Good morning. I appreciate you following along here today in our pastor's commentary videos. Yesterday in the sermon, we were looking at the book of Matthew's story and his version of Jesus' birth. And I highlighted the idea that Matthew, being that he is writing to a Jewish audience, is very intentional on the parts of Jesus' birth story that he tells and how he kind of collects that together, because he'll tell a part of a story and then he'll reference an Old Testament passage, and he'll tell a part of a story and he'll reference a prophecy that was predicted within this story. And one of the things that I thought was interesting in studying through the narrative was that what Matthew is doing is he's really kind of showing that Jesus is the new Moses, because he literally follows the story of Moses and the people of Israel's exodus through Matthew's chapters 1 to 5. And then when you get to the Sermon on the Mount, you kind of have a retelling, if you will, of the law that was given in Exodus at Mount Sinai, etc. So just follow the story, if you will. So in Matthew chapter 1, we're given the genealogy that takes us from Abraham to Jesus, and including the narrative includes David. And then we're told that Jesus is born, and these magi, these wise men from the east, come and visit Jesus. And then what we're told is that an angel tells Joseph, hey, this king who is now trying to kill all of the children in Bethlehem is trying to kill baby Jesus, and you should go to Exodus, which is really similar to the story of Moses. Hey, the king in Egypt is trying to kill all the children in Egypt. You need to hide this baby. And then Jesus goes, Mary and Joseph and Jesus go to Egypt. And then we have the Exodus. They come out of Egypt back into the land. And then we see the next sort of story that is told in Matthew is that Jesus goes into the Jordan River, and he is baptized. And the language that's used in that story is reminiscent of the language that is used of the children crossing the Red Sea. So Jesus enters into the promised land through the water, if you will, coming into Jerusalem, into Israel, into making the promise of the land. And then the story goes from baptism in the Jordan River. Jesus then spends 40 days in the wilderness. Again, replaying the narrative of the Old Testament, spending 40 years in the wilderness. And if you remember the story of the children of Israel wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, there were lots of places where they were tested, and they failed their testing, and they would complain against God, and they would complain to Moses, and they would say, God isn't taking care of us. And then Jesus is wandering in the wilderness for 40 days. He comes to a conclusion where Satan comes to him, begins to tempt him and say, hey, aren't you this? Or what about this bread or these things? And those three temptations that Satan gives really parallel temptations and troubles and trials that the nation of Israel faced in the wilderness. Bread, manna. And Jesus responds to Satan by quoting the Torah. Two of the three quotes, I believe, come out of Exodus. One of them, I believe, comes out of Deuteronomy. But he's quoting the Torah, showing, if you will, that if the people of Israel would be willing to do, or they would have done what God commanded them to do and live by the law of the Torah, then they would have come out with a different perspective. And then you get into chapter 5 and chapter 6 and 7, which is the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus is beginning to kind of reshape the perspective of the Torah. The Torah says don't murder. Jesus says, well, I say if you hate someone in your heart, that's just as bad as murder. Or don't commit adultery. And he says, I say if you lust after someone in your heart, that's just as bad as committing adultery. And so you have in the Sermon on the Mount, you have this retelling, if you will, of the commands that God gave off of Mount Sinai. And so what you see in the life of Christ, in the beginning of his life, up through the beginning of his ministry, where he begins to proclaim in Matthew chapter 4 that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, is you get to see a replay, the way Matthew structures the story, the way Matthew kind of puts the narrative together. You get to see a replay of the nation of Israel's deliverance out of Egypt, wandering in the wilderness into the promised land, hearing of the Torah and the law, and they get to see what that was like if someone would have done it the way God designed it to be done. And so when we see the story that Matthew portrays, it's different than the story that Luke and Mark and John portray about Jesus' birth. But what Matthew is doing is Matthew is telling a Jewish story to a Jewish audience, and he is trying to help people capture the reality that Jesus is the promised Messiah, that he is the one who is like the prophet Moses, who is the king who's like David, whose throne will be established forever, whose kingdom is present and here, who comes from the line of Judah, who's born in Bethlehem, born of a virgin, and is now the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So as you enter into this holiday season and you're engaging in the Christmas festivities, be mindful that you are worshiping the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And I hope you have a good day, and I hope you serve him well today.